My name is Frida Torres, and I'm the current guest editor of the third issue of Revista N'oj. Revista N'oj is the online publication of the Latinx Research Center here at UC Berkeley, and this edition of N'oj concerns the prison industrial complex and its impacts on our communities through mass incarceration, the militarization of police, and through other institutional implementations. Today, we're going to be speaking with Oscar Rivera, a Puerto Rican-born organizer, activist, and political prisoner of the U.S. prison industrial complex, and we'll be discussing his book, Cartas a Karina, which has been regarded as a letter to the youth of a nation and its future. Oscar, before we start this interview, would you be able to give us a quick overview of Cartas a Karina?
The book was an effort to really familiarize people with what happens between a member of the family and the person who's in prison. It was a way of connecting with my granddaughter, who I had the honor of seeing when she was only 90 days old. So when she was like 2 years old, to communicate with each other, because the only way we communicate was via a phone. And what happens with those conversations via telephone, it would not be proper for a 2-year-old child. So we started playing with our hands, and I would put the hands on the glass, and she would put her hands trying to match mine. And it was always this very joyful experience. And that went on for 7 years. When she was 7 years old, she was allowed to visit me. Having direct connections. Both of us were very happy, but she was very scared because she had become accustomed to using her hands as a way to play with me. This time was, we were touching each other, so it was a little bit scary of what would happen, and it was a good experience. My granddaughter is a precious person. The most important thing of the book probably is allowing people to familiarize themselves with what happens to a person who's in prison and what happens to the family members who visit that prison. Grew up doing that little by little, understanding more. Matter of fact, when she was very early, still probably 10 years old, she was not allowed to visit me because according to the guards in the prison, they said that she had some probably drugs with her. Now, I come from a family that has been completely far away from drugs. And my granddaughter, from that moment on, the only way that you come in would be that you have a set of clothes that you could put on and come into the prison with that set of clothes way before she would come, like, say, from Puerto Rico to the United States, just because she was afraid that you would be turned away for testing positive as a child. We're talking about a child that, this happened when she was very young, and throughout the years, while she was visiting me, it was always the same thing. She would come with shoes that had not been worn, clothes that had not been worn, and she would leave the hotel with those clothes on, making sure that nothing would interfere with the visit. So we went through that experience 3 or 4 times. And also, members of my family went through that experience 3 or 4 times. And it's very unjust for a person to travel from Puerto Rico, let's say, to any place in the United States, anywhere from Leavenworth to Colorado. They would have to travel, pay, and it would be a very expensive thing to do, and then not being allowed to come in and visit with me. It was painful. So little by little, fortunately, we were able to overcome that problem. The writings are strictly visions of what I went through, sharing with her some of the experiences that are part of environment, preparing her in a way to be as good of a person as she could be, as as responsible as she could be, as committed as she could be. So it was a very, very, very close relationship within the writings in the book. If we read, if anyone reads what I was written, we can see how the relationship was flourishing, how the relationship was growing, how the relationship was really, really, really could be of interest to other people, who, especially people who have a family in prison. So it became a fairly popular book, and I'm happy that we did it. I'm happy that it was put out, and I'm happy that it's still circulating. So I'm very, very grateful to my granddaughter for accepting uh, that part of her that is part of the book.
Yeah, thank you. Um, While researching Cartas, I realized that it was published in 2016, which was actually 35 years after you were arrested and faced charges similar to those brought against persons such as Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. And that you started writing the Cartas in 2013, but by this point you had already been imprisoned for 32 years, many of which you explained being in solitary confinement. What was it about your experience in prison at this point that led you to start developing those letters at that time?
I think that the good thing was having the opportunity to get my granddaughter a certain age already, and that she would be her letters to me, uh, uh, and my writing letters to her was this connection that we're creating, that we had little by little created. And I think that it was to both of us, to the advantage of both of us, to be aware of what was going on, what people or what I was going through, but other people were going through, what conditions are, what imprisonment is, what life in the United States is also something that we have to take into consideration. Uh, Preparing, probably the most important thing was to prepare her for the future. I think that she is the person that who she is. She's 30 years old now, and the dentist, very, very, very committed to helping people. So I'm glad that my granddaughter can do that.
Yeah. Um, Speaking of your granddaughter, these letters were addressed to her, and you even named the book after her, which is something incredibly intimate. But you explained that she was born while you were already imprisoned, and your daughter was also very young when you were sentenced as well. And even as you were describing, until she was 7, you could only see her through a glass window on visitation days. How do you think you two were able to develop such a close bond?
I think that the family had something to do with this. The way she was being raised has something to do with this. I think that we can kind of uh, get a sense, a feeling of the need to be in touch with our loved ones. And I think then little by little, that relationship continues to grow, and that relationship continues to be more and more focused on life as it is, more and more focused on situation, conditions. And I think that it's important for young people, is this case, my granddaughter, to become familiar with what imprisonment is all about, to learn to be very, very conscious of how people are treated and why are they treated in that way. And if she grows as she's growing now, to see that conditions in prison are so dehumanized. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that in probably 19 1987, Amnesty International declared the treatment of prisoners in Marion, Illinois, which was an enclosed penitentiary, and it was described as a legal crime what was being experiencing. So it is crucial, for me, it is crucial to see why would Amnesty International point that out to the public and how little response from the public we receive. It's almost like prisoners are dispensable and so they do not matter. The prison system in the United States is a prison system that looks more towards how to profit from the imprisonment of prisoners than how to move forward. And I think that when we look at this at a system that does not consider the prisoner as a human being, rather treats the prisoner as an object that is dispensable, that it can be gotten rid of. And I think that as long as we dehumanize the other, we are dehumanizing ourselves. And I think that that's what the prison system has been doing for ever since it was, I would say, ever since it was created, in order to control people, because that's the final goal.
Yeah, a lot of people actually don't know what it's like to be imprisoned. Would you be open to describing what being incarcerated for 36 years is like, especially when some of that time was spent in solitary?
It is a very uh, first of all, very painful experience to when you when a person starts to live in to in an environment that creates a lot of problems within the population. Uh, and when I arrived at the first penitentiary, which was Leavenworth uh, it was arrived there. Uh, and I made myself the promise to make sure that I would take care of my health and I will not waste my time. Time for me was precious. I think that Dietrich Bonhoeffer really pointed out how important time is to the human being. So I did not want the jail system to take my time away. I would use my time to read. I would use my time to write. I would use my time to help other prisoners who wanted help, especially if they were trying to learn languages, if whether it was English, Spanish, I could do that. Also, it was a way of trying to uh, familiarize myself with a system that I was not familiar with, and at the same time being able to do something productive. For me, the whole thing of not giving my health was important because it behooved me to take care of myself, and I did that purposely. It was something that I knew that I was not going to allow myself to be destroyed by the prison environment. And at the same time, by using the time properly, I was always busy. I was always doing something. I would take myself with my mind out of the prison walls. So I think that it was very, very, very crucial for me to do those two things. Throughout the 36 years, I was 12 days short of completing 36 years in prison when I was finally released. And for me, it was crucial not to allow myself to lose any of my hopes, any of my visions, any of the things that I believe were important for me, for my family, for Puerto Rico, and for all of humanity. There's this whole thing of labeling us terrorists. But I don't think that there was a moment in my life when I engaged in terrorizing any human being. So it was for me important to do things that were right, to do things that were correct. And there were moments when I found myself trying to force my other things beyond what I was doing when I realized that they were not going to release me at the time from one penitentiary at the time that they were supposed to release me or transfer me to another institution. And I started to paint in 1991. And little by little, I learned to paint, and it helped me a great deal. The paints that I did, the paintings that I did, they moved around different parts of Puerto Rico, different parts in the States, different parts in Latin American countries, but be able to do something that was very constructive, that I could help others with it, and at the same time help myself with it. So even though the thing of learning how to paint by myself, becoming my own teacher, it helped me a great deal, and it helped the inmates who were with me, because if I could paint, I would teach others to paint. So it was a very almost like what I consider a blessing that I could do that, and do it within a environment.
Your book actually talks about how prisons work well at depriving the individual. Many view deprivation in prison as only being the inability to leave. However, you explain how there's also deprivation of the mind itself through lack of education, socialization, and even the lack of self-determination. As you say in your book, it's a complete sensory deprivation. Could you explain why you think that prisons operate in this way?
Exploitation, right? If we talk about things that are denied to the prisoner, uh, we have a system prepared to really with the problem of imprisonment. I'm going to jump a little bit here to make this point clear. One of the things that I learned in prison was how a guard would have the power to do terrible things to an inmate. It would be if the inmate was not a person that the guard thought was a good person, the abuses that they had to endure, for me it was very difficult to see that. There were quite a few prisoners who had really serious mental problems, and they were never treated as a person who had a mental problem. Some of them would commit kinds of self mutilations. And to see a person doing those things, like for example taking an eye out, or cutting one of his fingers, or cutting another inmate, those are the things that for me were very painful to see in a system that could probably could deal with the issues of the mental problems. For me, it was very difficult, and I try to touch that in the book in a way that we can understand how is it that an inmate can be turned into this person who's self-destroying. We cannot. I don't think that that's the right way to treat a human being. And at the same time, the prison system will say that they were trying to rehabilitate. There's no such thing as rehabilitation. I never saw it, uh, because even when they had programs, educational programs, at a particular moment, all those educational programs were taken out and left a barren situation when it in an area such as education. Automatically that inmate would be left in limbo, because he will never have access again to the things that he wanted to have access to. And learning is important, education is important. If so, it is better to prepare that prisoner to walk out and be of help to the community and be of help, be an asset to the community, be an asset to the nation, if we wanted to put it like that.
Yeah, you were touching on how painting and teaching languages to other inmates really helped you while incarcerated. And your book even talks about how meditation, breathing exercises, and learning how to relax were key in helping you overcome the hardships of prison and solitary confinement. Um, could you expand a little bit more on the methods that you used to overcome the sensory deprivation? And would you have any practices that you would recommend to persons currently facing this uh, currently facing those conditions?
Yes, I think that we can use exercises. For example, I use deep breathing exercises to relax, to bring myself to a point, a condition that I would be, like feeling overwhelmed by the conditions. I learned, and I was. This is probably in the hardest of all prisons, uh, the one in Colorado, Supermax in Colorado. When I arrived there, probably a few weeks after I was there, there was some small group of prisoners. They still had not completed uh, filling the place with prisoners. They started uh, waking us up every hour. And when a person is awakened in every hour, what happens is that you're not sleeping, you're not relaxing, you're not in conditions to really feel healthy, or feeling like I want to exercise my body, I want to exercise my mind, because it is overwhelming. So when they told us that they were going to be counting us every hour, waking us every hour, they will come with a flashlight, hit the window. If we did not move, the prisoner in that cell would be very, very rough when they asked him to move, when they were putting a flashlight on his face. And subjected us to those conditions, I never allow myself to be in a position where they will try to extract me from the cell. I was there whenever they would put the flashlight. I would wait like probably uh, 45 seconds, and I would move to let them know that I am responding to them. But at the same time, I learned through deep breathing exercises that I could relax, that I could get myself in a position that I would not get nervous or anything like that. And at the same time, they had showers. We had showers in the cell. So what I would do, let's say that my body temperature would change. I would feel hot. I would open up the cold water for about 20 minutes, and automatically my body will begin to relax, to feel good. And if it was cold, I would, like open up the hot water and do the same thing. And again, my body temperature will come normal, and I will be able to function again, to get my mind clear and to be able to face whatever challenges they were going to bring up to me. And I did that for 58 days. On the 58th day, the warden of the penitentiary came to see me, and he said, "We're going to end the torture that we are uh, uh, practicing on you guys, and for now on, we're going to return to our normal count." And he did. It was we got back to a normal count like every 2.5 hours, so we could sleep, we could relax a little bit more. Well, he asked me to write to the people on the outside, because there was a campaign, a massive campaign, asking the prison system to stop the kind of incarceration where we would be awakened every hour, and that is a very, very inhumane thing to do. So there was a campaign on the outside, and it affected the and uh, they could tie up the connection out from the outside world to the prison. So the warden sometimes could not hear what was being said because the people were very effective on the outside world, very effective in maintaining. Let's say that started on the East Coast, and they would do a series of phone calls, and then go to the next state, next state, next state, next state, and it was a very effective way to get the prisoners tied up, and they were not able to receive information. That was the main reason why the warden decided to eliminate that terrible program that they had created that was forcing us to be awakened every hour, to be awake every hour. And it's a very terrible thing. One of the things that helped me in doing this too was that while I was in Vietnam, I was when we were doing night, uh, there will be two of us. So one will be awake for an hour, the other one will be asleep. But what I realized while I was in ADX was that if I was when I let's say it was my turn to go to sleep, I did not sleep an hour. It was most likely probably 45 minutes, because by the time I would put my body on the ground and start feeling, a way of relaxing, it would be probably 45 minutes. It was never an hour for me uh, to say, okay, well, I slept an hour. No, it was probably most likely probably 45 minutes. And the other person, let's say because we're replacing each other, the other person was going through the same experience. I doubt it very much if the other person ever slept more than 45 or 50 minutes, because we are on the ground, our bodies are on the ground, all the things that crawl uh, are going to come, whether they're ants or whatever, but they will be affecting us. So that kind of environment helped. By going through that experience, I was fairly well prepared to deal with the experiences that I was enduring in ADX at the time.
You said that there were some campaigns going on while you were imprisoned, and you explained that even before being in prison, that you were really involved with your community and organizing, and in your cartas, you reflect on your community and the changes that can be made to uplift marginalized groups. Could you explain why your community was so important to you before being imprisoned? And did the significance change at all while having been imprisoned?
Well, I think that one of the things that helped me deal, I came I was released from the military in 1967. I came home to Chicago, and I started working in the community. It was also a way of learning the conditions in our community, how our people were being treated, how difficult it was for young Puerto Ricans to really be left alone, especially in the city of Chicago. The police was really rough with young Puerto Ricans, and uh, by the time that we are like from 1967 until 1981, when I was arrested and sent to prison, I learned quite a bit of how to live in a more healthy environment. For 11 years, I became a vegetarian, and when I was arrested, my health was good. When I left Vietnam, I was in poor health. When I was put in prison during from 1967 until 1981, those 14 years, I used those years to really try to live a life that was healthy. When I was released from the military, it was in Chicago. I was drafted in Chicago. When I came, it was to Chicago that I came to. But when I started organizing in the community, it was completely different because I would definitely come to Puerto Rico. I would go and uh, try to develop a good relationship, a relationship that was completely different than what was Vietnam and what was prison. So it is that middle, what I can call a middle between a hell of an experience in Vietnam and a hell of an experience in prison, that I think I was able to really grow from 1967 until 1981, and that I was fairly well prepared to face the conditions in prison.
During this time, you speak a lot on how um, you helped nourish and helped organize in your community. Can you explain why you found that to be so important to you?
I think that Vietnam changed me completely. You know, I knew nothing about Vietnam when I arrived in Vietnam. I knew nothing about war when I arrived in Vietnam. But the conditions when we see where we are witnesses to something that is terrible, you know, the way that the Vietnamese were being treated, and we were given orders to do things that were very dehumanizing, and for me, even to this day, it's very difficult to think that what we did in Vietnam was not horrible. It was a horrible experience. Uh, so when I came home, I had made myself a commitment to at least learn as much as I could what Vietnam's history was, and it was a very, almost comparing what we had lived in Puerto Rico with Vietnam. It was very the whole thing of how a nation can come into a country and try to take it over, and how the military forces are used to take over that country, and the destruction that it does. Over 2 million Vietnamese people were left dead uh, from the moment the United States takes over to the moment that they leave the country. But the destruction was very terrible. Agent Orange, for example, was used in Vietnam, and a lot of the Vietnamese people are still being victimized by Agent Orange, and a lot of the veterans were also victimized by Agent Orange. There are a couple of uh, persons that who I knew in Vietnam and died not not long after they came home. And the problem was Agent Orange. And at that particular moment, a lot of people did not know what Agent Orange was. Agent Orange becomes more of an issue as time as prison as soldiers come home and uh, begin to show how that disease destroys the human being. And I think that uh, for me, knowing that we still can find Agent Orange in Vietnam is painful because it affects the human being, and it affects the environment, it affects uh, the future of people. So for me, it was finding out how terrible Vietnam had been for me as an experience, but at the same time, how I could use that experience to change and to create changes. And we're still struggling with uh, can we do something with Vietnam? Can we uh, at least go there and apologize? Can we say, hey, I, 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 I made a mistake by coming here as a soldier, and it will be like a release of the pain and a release of uh, the things that we endure in a war zone. So I think that is crucial because we still have a world full of wars. We still have people pushing, the thing of more militarism, and more militarism, and that's not an answer that the human uh, uh, should be engaged in. So for me, it's still a very, very difficult thing to accept when people are engaged in war.
Thank you for all of those answers, Oscar. That was the last question that I had for Cartas de Karina. But we've been hearing of some direction and important conversations taking place in the case of Puerto Rico. Would you be able to expand on those for us, please?
Puerto Rico has a history of colonialism. It has never been an independent or sovereign nation. And when the United States invaded and occupied Puerto Rico in 1898, what 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 it did to Puerto Rico, rather than help Puerto Rico alleviate the pains that Puerto Ricans had endured under the Spanish regime, it became worse. The United States, the minute that it took over Puerto Rico, the first thing, which is an interesting way of uh, pointing out what the United States did, was that they declared Puerto Ricans to be a mongrel race. We were lazy, and he made it clear that Puerto Ricans could not govern. We could not govern ourselves because we were not Aryans, and only Aryans could govern. So from that moment on, that has not at all, that still the same mindset that says Puerto Ricans cannot do it. Uh, and the structures that the United States government created in Puerto Rico from that moment on, for example, one of the first things that the United States declared was that Puerto Rico was a country that was overpopulated, and there were less than 1 million Puerto Ricans in 1901, when the United States government decided to take Puerto Ricans out of Puerto Rico and send them to Hawaii or send them to the Southwest states of the United States. And it was something that was absolutely not necessary. The other thing that the United States did right away was to devalue the value of the peso, which was the money that Puerto Rico was using to exchange with the world. Another thing that was hidden was the fact that Puerto Ricans were already trading by 1898. They were already trading with Europe. The Puerto Rican coffee in 1895 had been declared the best coffee in the world, and it had a market. When the United States took over, they forced the Puerto Rican coffee growers to sell the coffee to the United States at a price that was determined not by the Puerto Rican coffee grower, but by the United States. The other thing was to take over the land, and the land was used for sugar cane, and the sugar cane barons from the United States were profiting greatly. As a matter of fact, in 20 years from let's say from 1900 to 1920, the level of poverty in Puerto Rico grew exponentially. The people were starving. There were people who were really, really starving. Whereas before the United States came, they were working, whether it was in because Puerto Rico was selling coffee, was selling Rome was selling 3 or 4 different items to other countries, not only in Europe, but also in the Caribbean. So all those things were taken over by U.S. corporations. And little by little, we became poorer and poorer. In 1917, the United States was ready to go to World War I. And they imposed a citizenship, a false citizenship, have never been citizens of the United States, only to be able to use Puerto Ricans as cannon fodder to World War I and be cannon fodder for the United States. Those people went to prison for that. And that in prison continued was waged by the United States government, and those who refused will be put in prison. The Vietnam War also, Puerto Ricans who refused were sent to prison. So this is a history of how imprisonment was used against the Puerto Ricans. There's another good example of what the United States were doing to the Puerto Rican women, because they wanted to have less and less children being born. So from 1920 to 1940, over 35% of the Puerto Rican women of bearing children were sterilized. 35% of the Puerto Rican women. Again, the Puerto Rican woman was used on contraceptives as a guinea pig for the experiments of contraceptives. So little people know about how Puerto Ricans were treated and why we were treated the way we were treated. So we have a history of those kinds of exploitations, those kinds of destruction of the human being, the way of turning human beings into objects, turning human beings as dispensable objects. And to this day, I think that the mindset of the U.S. Congress has changed very, very little, because Puerto Rico should have been, rather than put in the conditions that we have been put in, Puerto Rico should have been its own nation. I think that Puerto Ricans have enough knowledge to run the country. I think that we have enough love for this country to make it a real what I call a paradise in the Caribbean. Because if we take Puerto Rico today, with the solar energy that Puerto Rico has, we have enough solar energy to electrify Puerto Rico to meet all the needs of energy in Puerto Rico just with the sun. If Puerto Rico becomes an independent nation, we will have access to 12 miles of water, seawater, that we will have access to. And those water, we can definitely develop fishing in plants that we plant in the sea, that they are, some of them are medicinal, some of them can be used in different parts of the world. But that's not what we are allowed to do. We are under the yoke of the colonizer. And I think that little by little, rather than conditions getting better, they're getting worse, because right now there are over 5 million Puerto Ricans living inside the United States, and less than 3 million living in Puerto Rico. And that was the original goal of the United States, was to get Puerto Ricans out of Puerto Rico and use both the land and the water. The land in Puerto Rico, when the United States government went into World War I, the land was used for military purposes. World War II, we have Vieques that became this massive military base for the United States, contaminating the water, destroying the water. And right now, Vieques is still suffering from the problems that are created by poisoning, by water that is poisoned, by water that had all those military things that were dumped in the ocean. And to this day, we have The highest cancer level is in Vieques in Puerto Rico because of the water. Just on how the water was used, how the military used and exploited the water and even the land. So uh, we're still in a situation, and probably very few countries in the world know what the situation is in Puerto Rico, but we're still struggling for Puerto Rico's independence. We believe that we have the inalienable right to be a self-government nation, that we believe that we can probably develop a paradise in the Caribbean if we are allowed to work on our own and to do the things that we know that we can do. And we do not think that the United States government is going to allow us to do that, because they're still very finding ways to make our lives as miserable as they want them to be. The level of poverty in Puerto Rico gets higher. Puerto Rico is becoming more and more a nation of the elderly. There's very little reproduction in Puerto Rico right now. And without reproduction, what future can we expect? The way the structures of the United States government to control Puerto Rico are still there. As a matter of fact, in 2016, the United States government imposed a fiscal control board to control Puerto Rico. I mean, actually, they can determine the way the money uh, it can be extracted from the university and used for something else. Uh, they can decide practically anything that they want with the economy of Puerto Rico. And the woman who's in charge of the fiscal control board is paid $600,000 a year. Why did they bring her here? Because she also did this in making sure that the money leaves Puerto Rico and stays in the hands of probably the banking industry or all the industries that comes into Puerto Rico. So I think that when we look at the conditions in Puerto Rico today and why we live in the conditions, the only one responsible, the main body that's responsible for the conditions that we live in is the Congress of the United States. It is the Congress of the United States that runs Puerto Rico. It's not the Puerto Rican people who are doing anything to control Puerto Rico. The control comes from Washington.